Let's look at the hydroplate theory for the origin of Earth's radioactivity. And this will help explain what is known as the heat problem, because if this accelerated nuclear decay has been, or if the nuclear decay, we measure the amount of a parent such as uranium, it decays into the daughter element lead, and based on the amount of lead that you have and the amount of uranium, you can tell how long this radioactive decay has been occurring. But because of the evidence that we have that this decay process was actually accelerated, we have to have a model to explain that. And so according to the hydroplate theory, radioactive elements were actually generated by the flood, and as a result, those decay rates were accelerated. So as the flood began, stresses in the massive fluttering crust generated huge voltages via the piezoelectric effects. For weeks, powerful electric surges within the Earth's crust, much like bolts of lightning, produced equally powerful magnetic forces that squeezed, according to Faraday's law, atomic nuclei together into highly unstable super-heavy elements, and those super-heavy elements quickly fissioned and decayed into subatomic particles in various isotopes, some of which were radioactive, which would be the natural radioactive elements that we see today. Alright, so now I'm going to show you this article, which basically says that there's competing theories in the conventional wisdom, within the secular scientific literature on the origin of these radioactive elements. According to this article from Journal of Geoscience and Environmental Protection, 2021 of April, it says that the article presents two opposing views. Two opposing views on the origin of natural radioactive elements. The primary forces of natural history presents a completely different view, considering the analogous influence of gravity on the formation of the globes of the solar system. The logical explanation of the phenomena of geologic activity are thermonuclear processes such as on the sun. Hence the conclusion that the elements chemical are now created in the core of the Earth in the process of thermonuclear synthesis. The problem is serious because there is an accelerated growth of new igneous matter containing the created elements, and the ionizing radiation of natural radionuclides is the main factor responsible for a radioactive level of the human environment. So right there, they're saying that currently, right now, there's new igneous matter being formed within the granite crust. Okay, deep within the crust of the Earth, we can, I don't know how they're measuring this, but they're saying that there is new material being formed, new radioactive material, new uranium, if you will, that's being generated deep within the crust of the Earth. Since February 2000, thousands of sophisticated experiments at the Proton 21 Electrodynamics Research Laboratory in Ukraine have demonstrated nuclear combustion by producing traces of all the known chemical elements and their stable isotopes. In those experiments, a brief 50,000 volt electron flow at relativistic speeds, self-focused Z-pinches inside a hemispherical electrode target, typically 0.5 mm in diameter. The relative abundance of chemical elements produced generally corresponds to what is found in the Earth's crust, and so the statistical mean curves of the abundance of chemical elements created in our experiments are close to those characteristic in the Earth's crust. They just send a huge voltage of electricity and it implodes onto the target, which contains a certain element or multiple elements they want to fuse together. They do this with lightning, and when they do this, it actually absorbs a lot of energy. It produces a lot of energy, but because the decay chain, it's absorbed right back into the fusion of the lighter but still heavy and unstable element which exists today. okay, such as argon, carbon, potassium, etc. Books have been written describing thousands of strange electrical events that accompany earthquakes, and some descriptions of the earthquakes worldwide include such phrases as flames shot out of the ground, intense electrical activity, the sky was alight, ribbon-like flashes of lightning seen through a dense mist, lightning flashes, globes of fire, and other extraordinary lights and illumination. Many reports of electrical storms that are actually occurring in the crust of the earth as a result of earthquakes. And so, with the natural geophysics of a global flood, it could be that huge voltages of electricity actually produced nucleosynthesis deep within the crust of the earth, which fused the elements within the granitic bedrock into super heavy elements, which then quickly decayed into the natural radioactive elements that we see today. So, with evidence of accelerated nuclear decay, such as high helium retention levels within tiny zircon crystals that are found in granitic bedrock, very deep geologic strata that's far beneath the sedimentary strata, little particles of dirt that slowly accumulate layers of strata over millions of years. Well, very far beneath that is one single layer that stretches down for many miles of granite. And within this granite, there are some tiny little crystals, little zircon crystals that contain helium, which is probably the lightest element that there is. It escapes at a very high rate, and under that much overlaying weight and heat and pressure, it cannot stay within the rock and for billions of years. And based on the rate at which it diffuses out of the rock and the rate at which it is produced from the uranium to lead decay. Okay, so uranium decays to lead, and in that process that's occurring in the granite, it produces helium. And so with the amount of decay that is measured and the amount of helium that is known to be produced as a result of it, we can measure how much helium has diffused, and only about 4,000 to 5,000 years of helium has been diffused from the rock, which is consistent with the model of a global flood that says that nuclear decay was actually accelerated. So when they measure a parent-to-daughter ratio of a radioactive element, they're measuring something that has been accelerated. And so it didn't take billions of years for the parent element uranium to decay into the daughter element lead. It was actually accelerated from the geophysics occurring during a global flood. And in fact, the radiometric elements themselves, the radioactive elements themselves, were created by the global flood. They are not natural to the earth. God didn't create the earth with these radioactive elements. They were introduced, they're generated by a global flood. So diffusion of helium has occurred for around 4,000 years according to measurements. The Precambrian rock represents a time before major diversity in life on Earth, and so they believe that there basically wasn't any diversity of life on Earth. There was just single cells, and this is the rock in which we find these helium retention levels. So the presence of helium suggests that the zircon crystals are actually relatively young, because if it was millions of years old, the helium would be gone. It cannot be retained in the rock for that long. Dr. Robert Gentry is a master's in physics. He was denied his PhD dissertation because he wanted to do it on the age of the Earth. And so there's an obvious bias against creationism in the prestigious literature, but he said that the relatively slow liberation of helium over several 20-second intervals observed in zircons from the surface all the way down to 2,900 millimeters is strong evidence that these zircons are virtually free of any microfractures, which have permitted a more rapid helium escape. So they're very isolated. There's no way for the helium to escape, and just based on that rate. It's around 4,000 years, and the Bible says there was a flood 4,500 years ago. And again, he entered doctoral program at Georgia Institute of Technology, but left when he was refused permission to work on the age of the Earth for his dissertation. There's obvious evidence of bias when it comes to publishing creation research, like I'm presenting to you in the prestigious literatures. Many have, are currently producing research and publishing it in this literature, but when they try to publish something that is evidence for a global flood, it's rejected, every time. Okay, and there's a lot of evidence for that, but let's go up here. So at the time of the flood, what's basically happening, let me find the right slide here. You have the Earth, which is one supermassive continent, and underneath it is most of the water that we see today on the surface of the Earth. It's in these subterranean chambers, okay? So the Earth before the flood is connected to the mantle here underneath the crust by pillar structures and probably many thousands of locations. It would kind of look like this, and over time, right before the flood, the water underneath it, because of the tidal pumping effects, has heated these pillars and heated the water in these subterranean chambers to a point where it is far above boiling. So it's called supercritical water. Water far above the point of boiling, trapped inside the subterranean chambers, made the crust and the pillars brittle and porous. And eventually it found a crack and escaped through the surface of the Earth, and so the Earth basically popped like a big balloon, and all of that water came shooting to the surface, rearranged the surface of the crust, and this occurred for about 40 days and 40 nights. Now at the time that the crust is releasing all of this water, it's going to flap like a flag in the wind. Basically, it's going to move up and down, and this is called flutter. As the Earth moves up, the pillars are relieved of pressure, and the downward movement drives the crust deeper into the mantle, and this compression produced piezoelectricity on a global scale. Piezoelectricity is mechanical shock that is converted to electricity. So if a piezoelectric element such as quartz in an electric lighter gets smashed by a little lever, just the compression on the element itself will produce a volt of electricity, which will combine with the gas and then produce a spark. And this is voltage produced by the deformation of certain elements such as quartz. And on a global scale, before the flood, the Earth flutters, these pillars are going to buckle full, and they're going to compress and be crushed by the weight of the overlaying crust and turn them all basically into lightning rods, which will surge huge voltages of electricity up through the crust of the Earth. So the supercritical water under the crust created pores and cut channels throughout the entire crust. And this supercritical water acted as fins as an engine to help conduct the heat that would result from accelerated radioactive decay. So one of the ways that you can remove the heat is basically to increase your surface area. Fins are used to increase the surface area in contact with the air so that the engine heat can be transferred more efficiently, and the shroud is the engine cover that directs cooling air across the engine fins. So when the supercritical water is cutting these channels and pores throughout the crust of the Earth, when things get really hot at the time of the flood, when this accelerated nuclear decay is happening, one of the ways that the heat can be eliminated is just basically by increasing the surface area. And with the high velocity at which the water is escaping the Earth, much of it just goes straight through. And so, let me get up to this slide here. Most of the water from a fire hose is instantly vaporized, but some of it actually passes through the fire. So the heat from the fountains was directed heat, and much of the heat was conducted straight out into space. And a lot of it could be just from the conduction, okay, increasing the surface area, the heat that's being generated deep within, where those granite pillars are, coming up through the crust with more surface area because of all of the channels created by the water throughout the crust. It increases the surface area, acts like fins on an engine, and then also you have the remaining heat conducted into the water itself that was present in the crust, and in turn it's already supercritical, and so this basically fuses a sea of neutrons from Bremsstrahlung radiation with the protons of oxygen-1 deuterium. So here are some isotopes of hydrogen. You have hydrogen with 1 proton, 1 neutron, which is deuterium, and then 1 proton and 2 neutrons is tritium. But this deuterium, this isotope of hydrogen, can be produced just by adding a single neutron, which you would have available with these huge voltages of electricity. We'll discuss Bremsstrahlung radiation, and then we'll get into more of the electricity part. Bremsstrahlung is breaking radiation, sudden stopping or slowing of high-speed electrons. The radiation given off in the form of a proton consisting of a single neutron when a magnetically charged particle decelerates. So all these voltages of electricity, because they're surging through the crust of the Earth, are and the Earth's magnetic field is significantly stronger before the flood. It is going to actually decelerate this flow of electricity, releases this Bremsstrahlung radiation, which is giving off a bunch of neutrons. They fuse into the water and create deuterium-2, and when you fuse lighter elements together, it actually absorbs energy. The fusion of heavy elements absorbs energy, like the fusion of 2 light elements, okay, into a heavy element actually absorbs energy. But quickly decays into lighter but still heavy elements, which absorb more energy. So anytime you fuse an element, it absorbs energy. Anytime the if element breaks apart, it releases energy. So if you can have the fusion of deuterium in this water, that can be another mechanism to which you can absorb all of the heat, which is going to be released from accelerated nuclear decay. So fusion, again, a mixture of elements absorbing, and that would be to cool off. Okay, so it absorbs heat, and heat is released when those elements are separated. Nuclear fission is splitting an atomic nucleus. This is the basic principle behind most of the nuclear reactors today. A Z-pinch is a type of plasma confinement system that uses an electric current in the plasma to generate a magnetic field that compresses it. So you get like a lightning bolt, which is superheated gas, several of them, and squeeze them together by a magnetic field. It's a Z-pinch, and it creates a huge level of electricity and voltage. So the quartz within the granite pillars was driven deep within the mantle to be highly compressed with literally the full weight of the world, and the cause and effect turned the entire pillars into lightning rods. So again, you have the earth connected to the mantle, these pillar structures connected in many thousands of locations, and they're all basically being turned into giant lightning rods, which will surge huge voltages of electricity up through the crust of the Earth. Heavier elements will be formed down here on the bottom because there's more high levels of electricity. The deeper that you are, the closer that you are to the underlying pillars, the higher voltage of electricity that you will receive, if you're the crust of the Earth. So the voltage of electricity decreases the higher that you go up through the crust of the Earth, and the lighter elements are formed at the top because there's less energy available. The closer that you get to these pillars, the heavier elements that you can get, which is why you find uranium and lead concentrations very high in the deep parts of the crust of the Earth, because they are heavier elements than the ones at the top. They have longer half-lives because the fact that they're bound together. Now, to explain this, thunder is a sound that results from the rapid expansion of air along a lightning strike. So that lightning strike is just a channel of superheated gas, and it expands the air, and that creates like a sonic boom because it goes faster than the speed of sound, and it also makes its own sound because it's expanding the air around it. And so when this happens in the Earth, it will actually expand the crust of the Earth, the dirt and stuff that's surrounding that channel of plasma, which will then quickly rebound on itself because of all of the heat and pressure. So the cause and effect of gravity acting on the weight of the crust caused the boundaries of the plasma channels to quickly rebound together, and the material within and around the plasma is stripped of its electrons from the current of plasma and forced to collapse. Fulgurites are formed when a variety of mineraloid lactellarites, they are formed natural hollow glass tubes, quartz, sand, silica, soil, fused together by lightning strikes. And in laboratory experiments, such as proton 21, we'll go to those right now. Proton 21, they fused heavy elements together. It's not a fusion reaction, okay, so it's not a sustained fusion. It is a fusion event, okay. There's a very quick fusion of lighter elements into heavy elements, which then instantly basically decay into other elements, which are radioactive and can be found naturally. So these super heavy elements, which are formed from fusion reactions, are never found on the Earth. They're only created in the laboratory because of the fact that they don't last long. But the elements that they decay into are the ones that can be found, and they are radioactive, such as uranium, lead, rubidium, strontium, samarium, neodymium, etc. The entire Earth was lit up by unimaginable surges of plasma, coursing through the Earth with each compression of the pillar into the mantle. The minuscule currents of electrodes snapped together in many places and expanded the crust around the channels of plasma. So if you had channels of plasma, like electricity, going through the crust of the Earth, instead of expanding the air like they do in the sky, in the atmosphere, instead of expanding the air and creating that loud crack sound that you hear, it actually expands the dirt and the rock, which then rebounds into that superheated gas and allows for this fusion to be possible. So you have a rapid fusion of super heavy elements. Now the heat that is released from the accelerated decay, because when these elements fuse together again, they're going to rapidly fall apart, that will actually release a lot of heat. But because the chain reaction is causing them to when this element rapidly decays, there's a decay chain that follows, and so a fusion of the lighter but still heavy element uranium will happen, and that will actually absorb the heat that is being produced by the rapid decay of the super heavy element. So heat released from the accelerated decay was conducted through the supercritical water in the crust, partly by the formation of deuterium. Many of it was forced directly out into outer space, and much of it was absorbed by the fusion of super heavy elements and the decay chain that follows from that, which would allow for the fusion of current radioactive elements today. So the downward flutter of the crust of the Earth would squeeze the water down into the subterranean chambers to be swept up into the flow and blasted into space. So a lot of the energy is going to be just shot up into space as the Earth, moves up and down the crust, squeezing all of that water up out of the Earth and into space. So laboratory experiments with super heavy elements shows that electricity can be used to create these super heavy elements, which then rapidly decay into the naturally occurring radioactive elements that they use today to calculate an age of the Earth. Helium retention levels show that those layers of strata cannot be millions of years old. You have carbon-14, which cannot last for more than 100,000 years, being found in seams of coal and dinosaur bones, and even in diamonds, and so it can't be a source of contamination where the carbon-14 somehow intruded naturally into the diamond, because of the fact that the diamond itself is the strongest element that we know of. Okay, it can't be penetrated by anything. It scratches any surface. Okay, they use diamond tip drill bits to penetrate into granite and get granite core samples. So there's no way that the carbon-14 could have intruded into the diamond. It is intrinsic to the diamond, so the carbon-14 and the diamond itself, they are relatively young. They cannot be millions of years old. And then you have the Z-pinch shock collapse model, which can explain how the geophysics of a global flood can actually produce voltages of electricity that are so high that they can fuse super heavy elements. And that can be used with some technical arguments to explain how we can get the radioactive elements that we see today. There's even been experiments to show that the radioactive elements that we see today on the Earth, the energy that is required to produce them is not even available in the stars. So that's another thing. If you look at all of the different ways that you can use to calculate an age of the Earth, most of them actually give you results that are far below millions of years. Okay, so they restrict the age of the Earth to actually less than 10,000 in most cases. In a murder case, for instance, there are several conclusions that you can come to just on the scene. And you could investigate those. You could give a DNA profile, fingerprints. You could go to the skeletal remains. You could go to the dental remains. You could do a criminal profile. You could look for, evidence of fire. You could look at the surrounding, other trace evidences that could surround it. You could look at native, insects that are native only to one location that can be found, in the radiator of a car, suggesting that they have passed through one area or another, and that could be used as evidence in the case to prove that they were, guilty of committing a murder or not. You could use other native things like plants that could be used in a murder case, and so this is all forensic evidence, and radiometric dating is part of that forensic evidence to determine the true history of this Earth. But the confidence within that piece of evidence is actually not as compelling as they propagate it to be. Material that was in, that is circumstantial to the evidence that you can't directly observe. So if you say that the Earth is millions of years old, you find ways to determine an age of the Earth. One of these is radioactive elements, but if again, most of the other methods you can use to calculate an age of the Earth would put it at less than 10,000 years old. So wisdom would tell us to look at the general observation, and then we take the exception to that rule and try to explain that in light of what we see. And so if what we're seeing is the Earth was destroyed by a global flood that is less than 10,000 years old, then we see if that can be consistent with the exception to that rule, which would be elements that seem to be yielding millions of years worth of decay. Elements in the Earth are radioactive. Now the question is, why are they radioactive? And the answer to that can be stars, or it can be the Earth. Okay, geophysics of the internal structure of the Earth, where it's alive, heat and pressure acting on the elements within the crust, turning them radioactive. This is the split in the two parties of conventional wisdom today, which are used to explain the origin of Earth's radioactive elements, and published in the scientific literature. There is now basically a division on whether or not they were formed naturally on the Earth, or if they were carried here from explosions that occurred in neutron stars.